Hello, my dear friends. Some people used to have sex through the walls of monasteries to keep themselves pure. Some used menstrual blood as a love potion, and there were even rituals to celebrate marriages between living people and animals. What you're about to hear is not a fable or a pornographic book, but real customs in medieval European society. When lust is stifled by doctrine and superstition, it overflows in the most bizarre ways. Tonight, we will step into that strange darkness together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever thought dreams were harmless, you wouldn't have survived long in medieval Europe. In certain parts of the continent, especially where church influence was strongest, even what happened in your sleep could be used against you. There were cases of women being accused of having sexual relations with invisible beings. It was not seen as a personal issue, nor treated as a symptom of illness or imagination. Instead, it was handled as an official religious offence. These cases often began with confessions made under pressure or whispers among neighbours. The moment a woman claimed she had experienced something unnatural in her sleep, or even if someone accused her of acting strangely at night, it could quickly spiral into a formal investigation. What made this accusation so dangerous was the minimal evidence required. A dream, a strange reaction, a sudden illness, or simply living alone could draw suspicion. The church promoted the belief in demons that seduced or assaulted humans during the night. They were given names like succubus and incubus, depending on whether they were thought to be female or male. These demons were believed to enter bedrooms at night, take human form or remain invisible, and engage in carnal acts with their victims. The victims were usually women, often young or unmarried, though not exclusively. Some were even nuns. These stories became more widespread as church authorities collected written testimonies from people across different regions. Some accounts described the presence as a shadow with weight. Others said they felt pinned down by something heavy, unable to move or cry for help. The experiences sounded similar to what we now call sleep paralysis. But in the medieval world, instead of seeking a medical explanation, they called in the priests and lit the torches. Once accused, the woman would be brought in for questioning. She would be asked if she had seen the face of the being, what it had said, what it had done, and how many times it had returned. Refusing to answer was treated as resistance. Giving too many answers was treated as collaboration with evil. There was no safe middle ground. Sometimes the women confessed just to end the questioning. Others were imprisoned for months until they broke down. They would say whatever the inquisitors wanted to hear. That included detailed descriptions of what the demon looked like, what it did, and how it made them feel. These statements were recorded in official documents as evidence of guilt. It didn't matter that most confessions were extracted under duress. The church sought to demonstrate that evil was a real and active presence in daily life. So they took these stories seriously, no matter how surreal they sounded. Public opinion made things worse. Crowds were drawn to these cases, curious to know what sins had been committed. People gossiped about what had happened, adding more details with each retelling. Some even claimed they had heard noises from the accused woman's home at night. These rumours were used to support the accusations. If the woman had ever been outspoken, lived alone, or had a problematic relationship with her neighbours, she became an easy target. Once convicted, she could be punished in several ways. Some were forced into cloisters for the rest of their lives. Others were publicly humiliated. A few were executed, though not always by fire. Sometimes they were drowned or left to die of illness in prison. The goal was to remove the source of corruption from the community. It's almost impressive how far people will go to blame their nightmares on someone else. This kind of punishment wasn't just about religion. It was about control. The church sought to regulate not only behaviour, but also thoughts and desires. A woman who spoke of sex, even in fear, was dangerous. She reminded people that desire existed outside the structure of marriage, so they turned her into a warning. Her case was read aloud in sermons, written into manuals for confessors, and used as a threat for other women. Over time, this created a deep silence around topics of sexuality, especially female sexuality. Women were taught to feel shame about their bodies and their instincts. They avoided speaking about anything personal, even to other women. That isolation made it easier for accusations to grow. A single sleepless night could cost you everything. What's most unsettling is how easily fear turned into certainty. A dream became a confession became a trial, and a trial became a death sentence. There was no room for doubt. The idea of demonic sex fit perfectly into the church's worldview. It proved that the devil was real and that women were his favoured targets. It reinforced the belief that female bodies were weak, unstable, and easily led astray. That belief lasted for centuries. It's not so different from modern times, when women's emotions are still questioned more than men's actions. The written records from these trials still exist in libraries and archives. They're filled with rigid handwriting and long descriptions of the accused. Sometimes the writing is calm and clinical. Other times it feels rushed, as if the scribe wanted to finish and leave. There are descriptions of facial expressions, of trembling hands, of tears. But nowhere in those records is there a moment of compassion. The women were always referred to as sinners, never as people who needed help. Their families were often shamed or forced to pay fines. Even after the woman was gone, her name carried the stain of accusation. There were rare cases where a woman was acquitted, but those were exceptions. In most instances, being accused was enough. People stopped visiting, friends looked away. No one wanted to be associated with a possible consort of demons. That fear bled into everyday life. Parents warned their daughters to keep quiet at night. Wives avoided speaking of strange dreams. Even touching oneself in sleep could be twisted into something criminal. I think what happened wasn't justice. It was just fear wearing a robe. And this was only one layer of the bizarre way medieval minds dealt with sex. It wasn't about morality. It was about suspicion and control. They turned desire into a crime and sleep into evidence. The line between imagination and sin became so thin that people were punished for things they didn't even do while awake. Things only get stranger from here. Next, we'll step into the world of medieval remedies, where sexual release wasn't always forbidden. It was sometimes prescribed, especially for women labelled as hysterical. While demons might have haunted the night, the living had their strange ways of managing desire. In some corners of medieval Europe, when passion needed a little push, people didn't reach for soft words or flowers. Instead, they turned to things pulled from inside animals. Hearts, livers, testicles, and kidneys became tools of affection, not in a symbolic sense, but as actual physical objects meant to carry power. It was especially common among women who feared their husbands were losing interest or wandering elsewhere. If a man grew cold or distant, it wasn't uncommon for his wife to slip a piece of dried frog heart under his bed. Some used the liver of a rooster, believing it would transfer masculine heat. Others swore by goat testicles, dried and tied in cloth, to restore the fire in their marital life. These charms weren't taught in public, but they were passed from older women to younger ones, often wrapped in old cloth with whispered warnings. The belief wasn't just about attraction, it was about control. In a world where women had little legal power and their bodies were treated like property, these strange tokens were one of the few ways they felt they could influence the course of their relationships. Most of these animal parts were hidden carefully, under beds, inside pillows, or sewn into clothing. Some women even buried them under doorsteps, hoping that with each step the man took in and out of the house, he would be walking over his bond of loyalty. The problem was the smell. These parts weren't preserved well. Even when dried, they often turned rancid. A faint odour of decay would sometimes lead to discovery. And when discovered, The consequences could be severe. If a man or another woman found the charm, it could be interpreted as sorcery. Accusations of witchcraft followed quickly, especially in households already under stress. It's strange how the same people who feared the devil had no issue hiding goat testicles in their bedroom. And yet, this was a reality in many rural communities. People believed that bodily essence carried power, and animals were considered full of symbolic energy. The heart for love, the liver for vitality, and the testicles for fertility and strength. These beliefs were tied to older pagan traditions, long before the church tried to stamp them out. But they lingered quietly, especially among the poor, where formal medicine and religious support were scarce. A village woman could not afford to visit a priest or physician every time her husband strayed, but she could get a rooster, boil its liver, whisper a few Latin phrases learned by ear, and place it in a bundle beneath the bed. The practice was rarely discussed openly. Even among other women, there was caution. Some feared being judged, others were worried their charms would be stolen or countered. In some cases, the same woman who made the charm for one client would craft a counter-charm for the rival. This quiet economy of meat, secrecy, and superstition ran beneath daily life, unnoticed by many but known deeply by those who needed it. The symbols used were not random. An unlaid egg might represent incomplete desire. A frog's heart could suggest stickiness, the kind of love that clings, and goat testicles were chosen not just for their shape, but for the animal's notorious reputation for lust. Men sometimes played along. Some, especially those who travelled or had mistresses, claimed they could smell a charm when returning home. Others used it as an excuse, saying they only strayed because their wife had cursed them with bad magic. In some church records, men confessed not to their infidelity, but to their wives' supposed sorcery. They brought in old bundles wrapped in cloth, demanding judgment. And the church, eager to maintain authority, often took the side of the husband. It's not much different from modern times when blame shifts easily to the nearest woman. When women were caught, they were rarely given a chance to explain. A piece of animal tissue found in the wrong place was enough to call for punishment. In lighter cases, it meant humiliation, shaving of the head, or being barred from church. In more severe accusations, especially if someone fell ill or died shortly after, the woman could be labelled a witch and imprisoned or executed. What began as an act of protection became a risk to her life. Still, the practice continued, passed quietly through generations, handwritten in margins of herbal books or whispered between cousins. The smell of these charms lingered in more ways than one. In humid houses with low ceilings and hay-stuffed bedding, even a dried sliver of liver could sour the air. Some tried to mask the odour with herbs like sage or lavender, but that wasn't always effective. Men who noticed would often say nothing if the charm seemed to work. If their appetite returned, or they slept more peacefully, they might not question the bundle under the bed. But the moment something went wrong, impotence, a bad dream, or a restless child, the charm would be blamed. People wanted reasons, and it was easier to blame a dried chicken part than face the messiness of human relationships. Personally, I find it sad that women had to rely on rotten meat to feel some sense of security in their own homes. They weren't trying to curse anyone. Most just wanted affection, consistency, or at least a bit of attention. But the world gave them little to work with, so they turned to what they had, old rituals and bits of bone. These were not grand ceremonies. There were no candles or chanting, just a handful of meat, a scrap of cloth, and a wish. And sometimes that was enough to make them feel in control, or at least less alone. Things only get murkier when you look at how sexual acts were not only managed in the home, but also in public. In the next part, we'll step into the private rituals of medieval medicine, where sex wasn't hidden, but prescribed for mental health, no less. Back in medieval times, control over the body was never really yours. Even the most private actions could become the focus of suspicion and punishment. One of the most heavily policed acts was something many people today consider natural and harmless. Masturbation, especially among men, was treated not as a personal matter but as a spiritual crime. The Church declared that every release of seed outside the purpose of procreation was equivalent to wasting human souls. They claimed each drop of semen held thousands of tiny potential lives. To spill it without the intention of making a child was described as killing beings that were never allowed to be born. The term murder of the unborn was not a metaphor to them. It was written down, preached from pulpits, and taken very seriously in religious courts. This belief shaped daily routines, especially in monasteries and religious households. Young boys entering service to the church were warned early and often about the dangers of touching themselves. They were told that even a thought could invite damnation. Rules were created to prevent temptation. Beds were made hard, blankets were thin, and baths were taken quickly and cold. Meals were kept bland. Eyes were expected to remain lowered, and hands were often required to stay visible while sleeping. These physical restrictions were all meant to deny the body any pathway to desire, but of course, desire never needed permission. It came with the body and did not obey the rules. The Church had answers for that too. If a young man experienced a nocturnal emission, it was rarely seen as a natural event. Instead, it was treated as a sign that he had harboured sinful thoughts. He might be questioned, scolded, or even punished. Some monasteries required young novices to report such events and perform days of penance. Others demanded fasts or hours of prayer on cold stone floors. If the events repeated, the youth might be publicly humiliated or removed from training entirely. It is difficult not to laugh at a system where natural biology was treated like witchcraft. But for those who lived under it, it was not funny. It was terrifying. The obsession with semen as life force had roots in ancient ideas, but was taken to extremes during the medieval period. Certain texts claimed that wasting seed weakened the soul and body. Confessional handbooks described in detail the penalties for men who admitted to the act. These could include beatings, shaving of the head, or fines. In some towns, a man caught by his family or a servant might be brought before a priest to explain himself. The response depended on the region and the mood of the local clergy, but in most cases, shame was used as the first tool of correction. The idea was not only to stop the act, but to make the memory of being caught painful enough to prevent future offence. This control extended into private homes as well. Parents, especially in devout families, kept close watch on their sons. Beds were sometimes shared by siblings, not for warmth, but for surveillance. If a boy were left alone too long, questions would be asked. Even the placement of hands during sleep became something to notice. If stains were found on clothing or bedding, they could be brought to the local priest as proof. The conversation that followed would not be gentle. The young man would be told that his action had killed souls that could have become saints. He would be told that his weakness had opened the door to the devil, and he would be told that God was watching even in the dark. It reminds me of how some modern systems use surveillance to control behaviour, except this one started in your bed. The policing of private acts became so routine that many people learned to fear even their thoughts. They avoided looking at their bodies. They learned not to speak of certain things. Over time, this created deep silence around natural functions, a silence that fed guilt and confusion for generations. Women were less frequently accused, but not completely ignored. A woman who showed too much interest in her own body, or who was seen spending time alone, could also be questioned. Some female saints were praised for injuring themselves to avoid temptation. There were even stories of women who disfigured themselves out of fear that they might arouse desire in others. These tales were held up as examples of virtue. The message was clear. Control over the body meant pain, denial, and fear. Anything else was considered sin. In some cases, medical problems were misinterpreted as signs of sin. If a man developed a rash or swelling, it might be said that he had committed acts of impurity. If a woman suffered from tension or irregularity, she might be accused of indulging secret thoughts. Rather than treat the body with care, the focus remained on punishing the will. Healing was rarely part of the process. People were made to confess, not to recover, but to confirm their guilt, personally. I think this reveals more about the fear of losing authority than any genuine concern for souls. The church wanted order, and that meant eliminating anything unpredictable, even if it came from inside a person. Texts from the time show how widespread these beliefs became. Manuals for confessors offered lists of questions to ask, signs to observe, and penalties to assign. They treated the human body like a leaky container, always at risk of spilling sin. There was little room for joy or curiosity. Instead, there was fear. Fear of God, fear of neighbours, fear of oneself, and that fear shaped generations. Boys grew into men who distrusted their own impulses. Girls grew into women who thought their bodies were dangerous. The silence lasted longer than the rules. Even among those who didn't fully believe, the pressure to conform was strong. Few dared to speak out. Fewer still tried to change the system. The cost of being different was simply too high. So the fear continued, passed down quietly, tucked into sermons, sewn into bedtime warnings. It followed people into adulthood, marriage, and old age. And it left behind not just rules, but habits of shame that survived even after the punishments faded. It is strange to think that a moment of solitude could once be treated like a public crime. But in medieval times, the body belonged not to the self, but to a system that watched and punished from within and without. Soon, we'll move into even more uncomfortable territory, where physical touch was not forbidden, but assigned as treatment. Because for women labelled with hysteria, pleasure was not a sin, it was a prescription. After punishing the private urges of men, the medieval world turned its gaze toward the women who dared to satisfy themselves. Unlike their male counterparts, women were expected not only to abstain, but to feel nothing at all. Desire in women was framed as something unnatural or demonic, unless it served a husband's needs or led directly to childbirth. And yet, despite the rules and constant warnings, some women sought out ways to experience pleasure on their terms. This led to the creation and use of rudimentary dildos, crafted from materials both humble and strange. Some were made from carved wood, smoothed and oiled for easier use. Others came from the bones of animals, shaped and filed into blunt forms. These objects were never sold openly. They were handmade or traded discreetly, passed between women with nervous hands and whispered advice. The women who owned them were not always what people might expect. Some were widows, long cut off from marital relations but still very much alive in body and mind. Others were unmarried or living in convents, surrounded by vows of chastity and silence. A few were even married but deeply unsatisfied. They turned to these tools not out of rebellion, but out of simple human need. Pleasure, in those moments, was not an act of sin. It was a way of feeling present, of remembering that the body could still respond. But owning such an object was dangerous. If discovered, it could lead to accusations of witchcraft, possession, or intercourse with unnatural instruments. The term used in some court records was pseudo-coel, a phrase that carried both disgust and confusion. These items were usually hidden in places unlikely to be searched. Inside folded linens, beneath loose floorboards, or sewn into the lining of a travelling cloak. Some women even kept them in pouches tied beneath their dresses or concealed in hollowed religious books. But secrecy was never guaranteed. A nosy servant, a suspicious relative, or a sudden death could expose the hidden object. Once found, it became public property, examined and described in humiliating detail. One can only imagine the awkward silence as a room full of old men debated the curvature of a carved stick. Trials followed. The woman would be questioned relentlessly. Why did she have it? Who gave it to her? How many times had she used it? There was rarely a safe answer. Denial invited accusations of lying. Confession invited punishment. Punishments varied depending on the region and the reputation of the woman involved. A widow of good standing might be spared physical harm but condemned to lifelong penance. A nun could be stripped of her position and exiled. A peasant woman might be beaten or locked away. The object itself was usually burned, sometimes in public, as a symbol of moral cleansing. The spectacle served as a warning to others. It told women to stay within their roles, to wait for permission, and to forget their own needs. It is not so different from today, when women are still judged for seeking pleasure outside of someone else's expectations. The Church saw these acts not only as sins of the flesh, but as challenges to divine order. A woman who took pleasure without a man's involvement was seen as dangerous. She disrupted the belief that female desire should only be passive, responsive, and controlled. By acting alone, she claimed authority over her own body, and that, more than the object itself, was what frightened the moral authorities. Some religious leaders wrote that such women were likely to be tempted by demons. Others claimed that the use of artificial instruments would open the door to further sins. Books on confession began listing tools of impurity as a category of offence, alongside more familiar acts like adultery or fornication. Despite the risks, the practice never disappeared. Women continued to create and hide these objects. In some households, they were passed down quietly, along with other heirlooms. Sometimes, they were disguised as religious items or sewing tools. Others were buried with their owners, hidden in the folds of burial gowns or tucked into coffins by loyal friends. The secrecy was an act of resistance, not always conscious, but powerful in its quiet persistence. It was a reminder that even under layers of shame and control, human desire found a way to survive. I think these women were not rebellious or immoral. They were just human beings asking for a moment of peace in their own bodies. They weren't trying to offend the Church or challenge society. They were trying to remember what it felt like to be whole, in a world that punished women for thinking, speaking, and even dreaming too freely. Holding a carved piece of wood became a silent declaration of existence. Some rare texts hint at a more forgiving view. A few midwives and female healers acknowledged the practice and saw no harm in it. One or two even suggested it as a remedy for cold womb or melancholy of the flesh. But these voices were drowned out by louder ones calling for purity, obedience, and punishment. The safer choice, for most women, was silence. They kept their secrets hidden in cloth and cedar. They kept their thoughts behind closed lips, and they waited, hoping no one would look too closely at what was stored beneath the bed. It is hard not to notice the irony of a society that feared pleasure more than violence. Women could be beaten for protecting themselves, starved for speaking out, and imprisoned for surviving alone. But if they found a moment of comfort carved from a branch, it was treated like heresy. Soon, we'll see how that fear of female autonomy led to another strange development. Because in some cases, what began as punishment turned into treatment. And the same hands that once held whips were now holding herbs, declaring that women needed a release to cure their wandering minds. After carved wood and animal bone had been hidden or burned, medieval women still found new ways to assert themselves quietly. When touch was forbidden and pleasure punished, other senses began to take on deeper meaning. Among them, smell became the most powerful. It was not a time of perfume and soaps. For most people, scent came from the body itself. Sweat, breath, the oils of skin left behind on cloth. In brothels and poorer households, these traces were not seen as waste. They were seen as tools, especially the sweat of men. Some women, particularly those who worked in the sex trade, began to notice a pattern. A client who stayed longer or returned more often was often drawn by something beyond looks or words. The heat of the encounter, the feel of a room still holding the trace of his scent, seemed to pull him back. These women started to collect what was left behind. A crumpled linen rag, a damp corner of a shirt, a used kerchief. These items were not washed or discarded. They were folded, stored, and used. One of the most common methods was simple. After a man left, the woman would take the cloth that had absorbed his sweat and hide it under her mattress or pillow. Sometimes she would keep it in her blouse, letting the smell mix with her own skin. On the next visit, she might dab it on her neck or hands, or she might not touch it at all, simply letting it sit where he would sense it without thinking. The belief was that the body remembered, even if the mind did not. Some went further. Sweat was collected and added to bath water. A woman might press a damp cloth into a bowl, squeezing out the last drops, then pour it into a wooden tub along with herbs or oils. The goal was to soak in what was left of him, to absorb not just his scent, but what they called his heat or spirit. It is hard not to smile at the idea of turning a man's body odour into a beauty treatment, but to them, it was nothing strange. It was a way to keep a connection alive, a way to make the next visit more likely. The practice was not limited to brothels. Some married women, especially those whose husbands travelled often or seemed distant, began to do the same. The sweaty undershirt might be boiled in water, then cooled and stored in a jar. That water could be used to wash undergarments or to wipe down furniture near the bed. Some believed it helped restore affection. Others thought it encouraged dreams. The connection between scent and memory was strong. Even men who never knew what had been done sometimes found themselves more drawn, more settled, more attached. It reminds me of modern advertising tricks, where a familiar scent evokes a memory without you realizing why. The women of the Middle Ages had no scientist to explain these effects. They relied on observation, and they shared their knowledge quietly, from one to another, without books or formulas. Older women taught younger ones. Midwives passed tips during childbirth or healing visits. Friends whispered about it during laundry or food preparation. The church, of course, was not pleased. Sweat was seen as part of the fallen body, something to be removed, not treasured. Using it to influence someone else was treated as a form of manipulation. In some regions, sermons warned against the use of bodily fluids in magic or temptation, but the warnings rarely reached the places where the practice lived. These were not women of influence or education. They were survivors, using what little they had. Personally, I think these women showed more intelligence and courage than they are ever given credit for. In a world that offered them almost no control, they found subtle ways to shape outcomes. They did not raise swords or shout in public. They worked quietly, folding cloth, saving jars, soaking hands, and for many of them, it worked well enough. The items used were ordinary: cotton rags, wool sleeves, linen scraps. The tools were nothing more than bowls, pins, or cords. But behind those simple things was a careful logic. Some believed that the scent of a man was strongest if taken within an hour of climax. Others waited until the body cooled, thinking the spirit settled deeper in the fabric. Some stored the cloth in clay pots sealed with beeswax. Others kept them in locked chests beside religious items, hoping that contrast would prevent suspicion. Punishment was rare, only because the practice was difficult to detect. There were no spells or incantations, no visible rituals, only a scent, faint and fading, carried on clothing or caught in the folds of a blanket. But if discovered, it could lead to harsh consequences. A woman accused of using a man's sweat to control him might be labelled as impure, manipulative, or even dangerous. In rare cases, such women were charged with low forms of sorcery, especially if the man later grew ill or behaved strangely. Still, the practice continued for centuries. It was passed in silence and secrecy, never written down, but always remembered, and it left behind no artifacts, no preserved jars or labelled cloths, only stories, scattered through confessions and folk tales, and perhaps a few fragments in the corners of old houses, long since lost to time. It is strange how what we throw away today could once carry so much meaning. A piece of cloth, a drop of sweat, a smell lingering in the air. In the medieval world, These were not garbage. They were threads of connection, and for women with no wealth or power, they were sometimes all that could be used. In the next part, we will step into a world even more uncomfortable. A world where male dominance was not just expected, but sometimes enforced through rituals and laws that tried to break the will of women entirely. Because when scent failed, force was often next. By the time scent had faded from the sheets and suspicion filled the air, another strange practice began to take shape. It came not from the brothels or the laundry rooms, but from the corners of medicine and folk healing in medieval Europe, where knowledge of the human body was limited and fear of the unknown was strong. Unusual symptoms often led to even more unusual treatments. One of the most misunderstood conditions at the time was what they called hysteria. It was a broad term, used mostly for women, to describe anything from anxiety and sadness to seizures or emotional outbursts. When a woman cried too often, fainted without warning, or showed signs of agitation, she might be labelled as hysterical. And once that word was spoken, anything could be justified in the name of relief. Many healers believed that hysteria came from the womb, not just from its physical state, but from its movement. Some thought the womb could wander inside the body, pressing against organs and creating madness. Others believed it became inflamed from lack of intimacy, and that its tension needed to be released. This led to a treatment that today might sound more like abuse than medicine. Some women were advised to engage in sexual activity as a way to bring balance back to the body. For married women, this meant being told to lie with their husbands more often, regardless of desire. For unmarried women or widows, things became more complicated. Folk healers, often men, offered what they called therapeutic touch. This involved manually stimulating the woman's genitals until she experienced what they described as a release. The procedure was not framed as sexual, it was clinical, done with the justification of easing pressure in the womb and calming the nerves. Some midwives adopted the method as well, especially for women who suffered from irregular cycles or persistent tension. The treatment was often done in private, away from curious eyes, but not always with consent in the way we understand it today. It is uncomfortable to imagine how many women were touched in the name of healing, when all they wanted was to be left alone. As time passed, tools were introduced to make the process easier. These were simple devices, often made of wood or leather, and operated by hand. Some vibrated through cranking or pounding, others simply relied on pressure. They were not common, but in certain brothels or healing houses, such instruments were kept and used under the name of medicine. A woman labelled with hysteria might be brought in by her family, examined, and then treated with these tools. No one asked her what she felt. No one explained what was being done in words she could understand. The focus was not on her comfort, but on controlling her behaviour. If she stopped crying or screaming, the treatment was considered a success. This approach was never formally accepted by the church, but it was tolerated in certain places. Religious leaders were often more concerned with the symptoms than the method. If a woman returned to her duties and stopped causing concern, few asked what had been done. Some church records even mention healing sessions where the priest remained outside the room while a midwife performed the procedure. The justification was always the same. The woman had been healed. She was calm again. She was no longer dangerous. Personally, I think these treatments had less to do with healing and more to do with silencing women. The idea that a woman's unrest came from her body and not her circumstances allowed those around her to avoid harder questions. They didn't ask if she was unhappy, lonely, or mistreated. They assumed her womb was restless and needed to be soothed. There were other so-called cures as well: cold baths, bleeding, and fasting. Some were told to sleep on hard surfaces or eat only dry bread, but none of these matched the intimacy and violation of the gentle massage. It blurred the line between healer and abuser, between patient and subject, and yet it persisted. Women came and went from healing rooms, sometimes returning again and again, unsure if they were being helped or harmed. There was no language to describe what was happening. There were no rules, only the quiet belief that something inside them was broken, and that someone else had the right to fix it. It is almost comical how quickly fear turned into permission. A woman who showed emotion could be dismissed as sick, and once labelled sick, her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the person holding the cure. Whether that cure came from a hand or a tool, the result was the same: control disguised as compassion. Over time, a few women began to resist. Some refused treatment. Others fled from healers or spoke to midwives they trusted. In certain towns, whispered warnings began to spread. Not every healer was safe. Not every touch was holy. But the power imbalance was too strong, and the fear of being left untreated, or worse, being labelled insane, kept many quiet. They accepted the treatment because the alternative was isolation or confinement, and they hoped that maybe, with time, the symptoms would fade and they would be left alone. Some instruments from that period still survive in museum collections, though rarely labelled for what they were. Wooden rollers, padded handles, leather straps. They sit behind glass with vague explanations. Few want to say aloud what they were truly for. The silence of the women who endured them still lingers, just beneath the polished surface. It is painful to think that what we now call abuse was once written into prescriptions. The body, especially the female body, was never free in the medieval world. It was always waiting to be corrected, reshaped, or calmed. In the next part, we will step away from medicine and return to ritual, where the boundary between sex and sacred became even more blurred. Because in some forgotten corners of Europe, people believed that touching a corpse could bring fertility to the living. After all the rituals of the living, some turned to the dead, in the more hidden corners of medieval Europe, where folk beliefs mixed with fragments of pagan traditions and misunderstood religious ideas. There were whispers of practices most people dared not speak of. These rituals were not part of public life. They did not appear in sermons or festivals. They were passed from one desperate person to another, usually in moments of fear, grief, or helplessness. Among the strangest was the belief that having intercourse in or beside a coffin could bring fertility, luck, or spiritual cleansing. This belief was never widespread, but it surfaced often enough to appear in the private writings of midwives, healers, and occasionally in church court records. The idea was that life and death shared a narrow line, and by performing an act of creation in the presence of decay, the balance would be restored. Some rituals required the couple to lie together on top of a closed coffin, usually freshly sealed, in the cellar of a chapel or in a family tomb. Others went further, encouraging couples to enter a burial vault or mausoleum and complete the act within sight or even scent of a corpse. It was not framed as perversion. It was framed as a necessity. Infertility was a powerful fear in the medieval world. A childless couple, especially one married for several years, would often be viewed as cursed or sinful. Women carried most of the blame. They were told their wombs were cold, their blood was weak, or their prayers were unworthy. Remedies included herbal drinks, long fasts, pilgrimages to distant shrines, and visits to known healers. But when all else failed, some were sent to the grave. A midwife might suggest the ritual in a hushed voice. A healer might insist that the spirits of the dead could bless the womb, and a desperate couple, willing to try anything, would obey. It is difficult not to shudder at the image of people undressing beside the dead while hoping for new life to begin. But to them, this act held deep meaning. It was about reversal, about forcing fate to turn, about confronting what they feared most in order to reclaim what had been denied. These rituals were sometimes guided by individuals who called themselves spiritual mediators or holy interpreters. They did not wear church robes. Religious orders did not approve them, but they spoke with certainty, using phrases that sounded old and sacred. Some claimed to have received visions. Others said their grandmothers had passed the knowledge down. The locations were chosen carefully. A private vault beneath a crumbling chapel, a grave freshly dug but not yet filled. A crypt is rarely visited. The timing mattered too. Certain days, such as the full moon or the feast of a martyr, were believed to make the ritual more effective. The act itself was supposed to be quiet and focused. Loud sounds or laughter were forbidden. In some versions, the woman had to wear a white veil. In others, the man had to remain silent throughout. Afterward, the cloth used was sometimes buried with a small offering, such as a coin or piece of bread. If conception followed, the child was often seen as blessed. If not, the couple was told to try again or to seek another tomb. It reminds me of modern self-help trends that make people do absurd things while convincing them it is the key to success. Of course, the Church condemned such practices outright. Any suggestion of physical intimacy near the dead was labelled unclean and blasphemous. But because these acts happened in secret and were rarely spoken of outside close circles, they were hard to police. When rumours did spread, they were often dismissed as gossip or superstition. Few people wanted to admit that they had ever been involved. Those who did confess often did so under pressure, and usually with shame. The punishment depended on the region. In some areas, it led to public humiliation. In others, it was buried along with the memory. I believe these rituals speak more about human fear than human desire. They were born not from lust, but from longing. The longing for children, for stability, for a future. In a world where medicine was limited and divine favour felt unpredictable, people reached for what they could, even if it meant stepping into a crypt in the middle of the night. Stories of these practices appear in fragments, a passing line in a midwife's notes, a strange accusation in a trial document, a whispered reference in a local song. None of them gives full details, but the pattern is clear. Death and fertility were linked in ways that defy modern logic, and yet, when faced with sorrow and pressure, people made choices that seemed reasonable at the time. Not all versions involved a real corpse. In some towns, symbolic coffins were used. An empty box lined with bones, or a bed shaped like a tomb, served the same purpose. The idea was to trick fate, to make it believe that death had already been faced and conquered. Whether real or symbolic, the meaning remained the same. It was a private battle against barrenness, fought in the most uncomfortable places imaginable. This belief faded slowly over time. As medicine improved and explanations became more grounded, fewer couples turned to tombs for answers. But the idea never completely disappeared. Echoes of it can be found in later rituals, such as sleeping in graveyards to dream of future children, or placing a lock of hair from a corpse beneath the marriage bed for luck. These customs lost their physical intensity, but the link between life and death, between sorrow and hope, remained. It is both haunting and touching that the place meant to hold endings was turned into a place where people begged for beginnings. No one wanted to be there, but many went because they saw no other path forward. Next, we will explore another quiet corner of belief, where not the dead, but parts of the living body became the focus. Because in the medieval world, it was not uncommon for people to collect strange items from those they loved or feared, and among the strangest of all were the ones made from hair, blood, and skin. After graves and rituals came something far less morbid, but no less curious. It did not involve bones or tombs, but the most everyday item of clothing. In the medieval world, undergarments were not just practical. They carried meaning, symbols, and sometimes hopes. Among certain groups of women, especially those who worked in brothels or lived by charm and trade, there existed a belief that flipping one's underwear inside out could enhance physical attraction. The idea was simple but strange. Wearing underclothes the wrong way around was said to trap a person's inner heat, holding desire closer to the body. That warmth, when released through touch, or even proximity, would awaken interest in others. The practice was not done by accident. It followed the intention. A woman might rise in the morning and choose to reverse her undergarment, folding it carefully and turning the seams inward. She would then recite a brief prayer or whisper a line from a folk verse, something learned from an older woman or passed down in the brothel. Some said the charm worked best if the cloth had been warmed by the fire or slept in the night before. Others believed the effect grew stronger if the same garment was worn for several days without washing. The point was not cleanliness, but continuity. The scent and texture were meant to build over time, creating what they called a hidden pull. This belief found its way into the routines of women who worked closest with men. Gai Lang Choi, especially those competing for wealthy clients, often used multiple layers. It was not uncommon for a woman to wear 3 sets of underwear, each with a purpose. The first layer was plain linen, soft and well worn. The second layer might have coloured threads or small pieces of ribbon sewn into the seams. The third and final layer was decorative, often embroidered with simple shapes or symbols. Some of these symbols were just patterns, but others were believed to carry meaning: hearts, knots, or crosses enclosed in circles. Not all clients noticed, but some did, and in noticing, they remembered. It is oddly clever how something as simple as turning a garment inside out became a tool of seduction. There were no perfumes, no jewellery, no polished mirrors, just cloth, heat, and belief. And in a world where women had few ways to influence outcomes, that belief mattered. The cloth itself was sometimes blessed or cursed, depending on intention. Some women asked for a midwife to speak over it. Others soaked it in herbal water and left it to dry under the moon. A few stitched in pieces of hair, tiny knots, or fragments of dried flowers. These acts were quiet and slow, done late at night, beside small lamps, with no one watching. The garments were not displayed. They were hidden, but never forgotten. Before a client arrived, a woman might adjust the fit, murmur a phrase, and walk a few slow circles around her bed, not as performance, but as preparation. In some towns, the church caught wind of this habit and spoke against it, not directly, but through broader warnings about impurity and temptation. Priests reminded their congregations that clothing was meant for modesty, not manipulation. But these warnings rarely reached the women they were aimed at. The women had no interest in what the church thought of seams and thread. They cared about results. If a man stayed longer, gave more coin, or returned with gifts, the charm had worked. If not, another method would be tried. It was a cycle of trial and error, as natural to them as cooking or cleaning. Personally, I see this less as magic and more as a kind of silent negotiation. The fabric was not just cloth, it was an effort, thought, a way to prepare for another day of uncertainty. In the spaces where power was unbalanced, even a thread could feel like a shield. Some women went beyond embroidery. They wrote small words on the inside of the fabric using ink made from ashes or crushed berries. The letters faded quickly, but while fresh, they were believed to carry strength, a name, a plea, a wish, written where no one else would see. Others carried tiny scrolls, no bigger than a finger, tucked into the waistband. These scrolls held verses, charms, or copied lines from old prayers. The writing was crude, the grammar uneven, but the meaning was clear. Keep me safe. Make him stay. Bring fortune. It is almost charming to imagine how much hope was folded into something so simple. A woman with nothing else might still find comfort in her own garment, turned backward, warmed by her skin, and held close all day. The practice was not limited to women in brothels. Married women also adopted it quietly. Some wore reversed garments when their husbands returned from travel. Others wore them to festivals, hoping to attract attention. Young girls copied what they saw, not always understanding, and slowly, the habit became part of everyday life in certain communities. It was rarely spoken about. There were no written instructions, just habits, passed through observation. This use of clothing as a quiet ritual is not unique to the medieval period. In many cultures, garments have been used for more than warmth. They have carried status, identity, prayer, and warning. But in medieval Europe, for the women who had little else, these reverse seams offered one more way to shape their world, even if only a little. They stitched and wore their intentions, holding them close, hoping for better days. Next, we will step into the church's more direct attempts to control desire, where even how long a husband could look at his wife became a matter of morality and danger, because sometimes even a gaze was considered too much. Among all the strange beliefs of the medieval world, some of the quietest rituals began with clothing, not outerwear or ceremonial robes, but something far more personal. For certain women, especially those in brothels or working in taverns, undergarments held more than just the body. They were believed to hold influence. One particular belief, not spoken loudly but passed along in whispers, involved wearing underwear inside out. This simple action was thought to stir desire in others, not just attraction, but a pull, a longing that had no explanation. The idea was that by reversing the garment, the woman's natural heat would be held closer to her body. That warmth, over time, would carry something invisible, something powerful. When she passed near a man, or when he touched her hand or sat beside her, that stored heat would begin to reach him. He would feel something stir without knowing why. It was not magic in the dramatic sense. It was a quiet trick of presence, a method to bring back a familiar customer, or to hold the attention of a husband who had grown distant. The act was always deliberate. A woman would take her linen undergarment, fold it carefully, then turn it so the seams faced inward. She would murmur a small phrase, sometimes a prayer or a line remembered from an older woman. The phrase was never loud. It was more of a thought than a chant. She would then slip the garment on and carry on with her day, knowing something had been done, even if no one else noticed. The confidence it gave was small but real. It helped her feel prepared. Some women took it further. They wore multiple layers. The first was ordinary, something soft and well worn. The second layer might include tiny charms or stitched patterns, added over time with pieces of coloured thread. The third layer, worn closest to the skin or just beneath the outer clothing, was the one reversed. That was the layer meant to hold desire. Some women embroidered symbols onto it. Hearts, loops, or simple spiral shapes are believed to trap energy. Others left it plain but soaked it in herbs before wearing. It is oddly clever that reversing a piece of fabric could feel like a form of power in a world where women had so little. It cost nothing. It left no mark, but it gave them a sense of control. In places where wealth and voice were not available, intention stitched into a seam was something to hold on to. The belief reached beyond brothels. Married women adopted the habit quietly. Some wore reversed undergarments before important events. Others did so before a partner returned home from travel. There was no public conversation about it. Women noticed what worked, then kept it to themselves. A look held longer, a touch that lingered. It was not proof, but it was enough. Sometimes the cloth was blessed, not by priests, but by midwives or older women known for their wisdom. A prayer would be spoken softly over the fabric. The cloth might be placed under a bed for a night or left near a window during a full moon. The point was not religion, but repetition, to turn the act into something more than routine, something that could be remembered when nothing else seemed to work. I see this less as superstition and more as a quiet way to feel noticed. When words could not be spoken and needs had to be hidden, this became a language of its own, a private signal worn beneath the surface. Some garments carried hidden additions, a lock of hair, a drop of perfume, or even a piece of thread from a man's clothing. These were sewn into the seams or tucked into the waistband. They were small, barely noticeable, but they mattered. For some women, it was a way to keep someone close. For others, it was a way to attract someone new. It was not about trickery. It was about being seen and remembered. There were warnings too. The charm was believed to fade if the garment was removed too quickly or washed before 3 days had passed. Some said it worked best when the woman remained silent during the day it was worn. Others believed that if a man discovered the secret, the power would be lost. These rules changed from town to town, but the heart of the practice remained the same. Reversing the cloth made a difference, even if only in the mind. The church, when it learned of such habits, disapproved. Sermons warned against charms and secret rituals. Women were told to seek modesty, not manipulation. But these messages rarely reached those who lived by coin and survival. The women who wore the reversed garments had no interest in being scolded by men who never looked them in the eye. They wanted to be remembered, chosen, and treated with care, even if only for one night. It is almost humorous how seriously some took a piece of twisted cloth while ignoring the real reasons people stayed or strayed. But in a time when conversations about desire were dangerous, symbols became safer than words. The practice did not leave behind much record. A few written mentions exist in the margins of herbal books, or the memories of old songs, but mostly it lived in motion, in the way a woman dressed slowly, in the way she adjusted her skirt before opening the door, in the way she smiled when no one was watching. These were not grand rituals. They were simple, soft choices, made quietly and with care. Some women stopped wearing the charm after marriage. Others never stopped. A few passed the habit to daughters or nieces, laughing softly as they explained the folds. There was no promise that it would work, but there was comfort in doing something, and sometimes comfort was enough. It is touching to think that something so small could carry so much quiet hope. A single flipped garment, worn beneath layers, carried not just fabric but intention. In the next part, we turn to an even stranger restriction, where the church stepped into bedrooms to dictate what was seen, not just what was done. Some believed that even looking too long at one's partner could bring sin or punishment. As strange as the rules around sex and desire had become, even stranger things were happening in the back alleys and herbal stalls of medieval towns. While most people feared semen as something sinful when spilled, others began to see it differently. For some healers and traders working outside the church's reach, it was considered a powerful ingredient, not just a symbol of life, but a physical substance with healing qualities. In particular, it became part of a series of remedies for two conditions often discussed in hushed tones. One was male impotence. The other was what they called a cold womb, a term used when women could not conceive or showed little interest in intimacy. The process was not public. It started quietly, usually with a cloth. After an act of intimacy, a piece of linen used to clean the man would be saved instead of discarded. That cloth would then be dried carefully, sometimes between two stones, sometimes on a flat rooftop under the sun. Once hardened and brittle, it was crumbled and ground into powder. The powder was collected and mixed with other herbs, depending on the target. For men, it might be added to a strong wine along with mint or crushed nutmeg. For women, it was mixed into warm milk with cinnamon or dried raspberry leaves. These mixtures were not sold openly in city centres. They appeared in outer markets, places where the rules were softer and the risks higher. The healers who sold them did not advertise what they were. Customers had to ask using coded words. Some called it the fire root, others called it the salt of men. The buyers were often embarrassed but desperate. A man might pretend he was buying for someone else. A woman might claim it was for her sister, but the healers knew. They had heard it all before. It is hard not to raise an eyebrow at the idea of drinking someone else's body in powdered form, but desperation makes strange things seem reasonable. People wanted answers. If traditional prayers failed, if baths and herbs brought no change, they turned to what they believed held life at its most basic level. And to them, semen was life. The belief was that by consuming this powder, one could absorb the heat and strength of the original man. For women, it was meant to awaken the womb, to encourage movement, to soften the body's resistance to conception. For men, it was thought to restore vigour, especially if the powder came from someone considered strong or fertile. There were even cases where clients requested powder from a specific man. He might be paid secretly, or the cloth might be stolen from a brothel after a visit. This trade existed mostly on the edges, border villages, crossroads markets, and gatherings of healers outside the city gates. The church never formally addressed the practice, perhaps because it was too hidden or too shameful to mention. But some records survive in confessionals, where people admitted to consuming strange drinks or powders without understanding what they contained. Others confessed to collecting the clothes themselves, unsure if their actions were sin or necessity. I think this reflects a deeper truth about medieval life. When people felt powerless, they turned to whatever gave them even the smallest sense of control. Whether it was a charm sewn into a hem or a powder hidden in a pouch, the need to do something often overpowered the fear of being wrong. The storage methods were crude. The dried powder was usually kept in small leather bags or glass vials sealed with wax. Sometimes it was hidden in hollow beads or stitched into the lining of garments. The smell was faint but unpleasant. To mask it, some added lavender or rose petals. The powders were rarely kept long. They were believed to lose strength quickly, especially if exposed to moisture or heat. Healers advised using them within a week, though some kept them longer, trusting in prayer or ritual to restore their power. The preparation was done in silence. Women who worked in brothels were often the ones tasked with collecting the clothes. They were paid a small fee and told to say nothing. Some refused, saying it was too strange or too risky. Others agreed, seeing it as just another part of survival. The clothes were sometimes marked with a stitch or folded in a specific way to identify the source. When handed to the healer, there were no words exchanged, just a nod, a coin, and a quick retreat. The use of the powder was not without danger. Some people grew ill from drinking spoiled, others suffered rashes or fever. But when it worked, or seemed to work, stories spread. A man claimed he felt stronger. A woman said her womb stirred after years of silence. Whether it was the powder, the belief, or something else entirely, no one could say, but hope kept the trade alive. It is both disgusting and strangely moving that people clung to these powders like promises. They were not just drinks or mixtures, they were small bottles of hope, passed hand to hand in shadowed corners. The practice faded slowly, replaced by better medicine and changing beliefs. But in some places, it lingered, passed through family lines, renamed, reworded, hidden in new forms. It never became mainstream, but it never fully disappeared. And like many other strange customs, it left behind more questions than answers. In the next part, we move from potions to public rituals, where desire was not hidden but openly celebrated, often in ways that challenged both the church and the law, because sometimes the entire village was invited. After cloth turned into medicine and desire was bottled in powdered form, there remained one more ancient path to hope. In some rural corners of medieval Europe, where folk belief clung stubbornly to the rhythm of the seasons, people turned to the earth itself not just for food, but for answers. These were places where the line between human life and nature was thin. Everything was connected. If the ground was dry, people prayed. If the crops failed, they wept. And in some villages, they did more than pray or weep. They gathered their bodies and offered themselves to the land. There was a belief that physical union, when done not in private but in shared ritual, could bring life to the soil. It was not about lust or pleasure, it was about survival. Whole communities would choose one night, often tied to the first sowing or the spring equinox, and assemble in a clearing, a field, or a forest edge. They came without banners, without trumpets, without spectacle. Just people, walking in silence, carrying blankets, herbs, or nothing at all. There was no leader, no single voice. The rules were not written but remembered. Some wore wreaths of grass or leaves, others covered their faces with clay. The atmosphere was not rowdy, it was solemn. a slow procession rather than a celebration. People formed pairs or lay alone, surrounded by others who did the same. The idea was that as the bodies moved together, they would transfer their heat and spirit into the earth below, that the soil would sense this energy and respond. Seeds would grow stronger, rain would return, illness would pass. It is hard not to shake your head at the thought of farmers making love to encourage barley. But for them, it was the same as watering a plant. The act was considered sacred in its way. Though it bore no resemblance to a church ceremony, it had its order. Fires were kept low, no one laughed, silence was respected. In some versions of the ritual, herbs were burned nearby to mark the boundary between the sacred space and the rest of the world. In others, people sang softly, using old melodies passed through generations, not written anywhere but remembered by voice. Participants ranged from young adults to older couples. Some were married, some were not. It was not about fidelity, it was about the community. If a couple could not produce children, they were encouraged to participate in the hope that the ritual would change their fate. If a family had lost crops the year before, they came to give thanks or ask for forgiveness. Each person arrived with a reason, and each left with the same silent wish that the earth had heard them. The church, unsurprisingly, was horrified by these rituals. They were labelled as sinful, as relics of pagan worship. Priests preached sermons warning that such behaviour invited disease and disaster. Some claimed that demons were drawn to these fields. That participants would be cursed. But the rituals did not stop easily. They were not organised by rebellion or politics. They were held together by hunger and habit, and no sermon could take that away. In some regions, church officials raided known gathering spots. People were caught, punished, and forced to confess. Some were whipped, others were fined, a few were excommunicated, but the rituals continued, just quieter. People changed locations. They moved the time. They used new songs. Still, the purpose remained the same. I think this was never about belief in magic. It was about people doing something, anything, when everything else had failed. Some communities replaced the act with symbols. Instead of physical union, they joined hands. They pressed seeds to their chests or poured milk into the soil. These acts were less controversial but still carried meaning. Over time, even these faded. But for a few centuries, in a few valleys and along riverbanks, people lay down together and gave their bodies to the land. What is striking is how little shame surrounded the ritual among those who participated. They did not speak of it proudly, but neither did they hide in guilt. Children were kept away, but older teens were sometimes included. It was a transition, not just into adulthood, but into responsibility for the harvest. One act, repeated each year, was believed to tie them to the cycles of rain, sun, and seed. There were no grand orgies or scenes of chaos. It was quiet, even restrained. The belief was that the earth responded best to sincere energy. If the act was done with disrespect, it would backfire. Crops would die, livestock would weaken, families would suffer. So people came with clear minds and heavy hearts, knowing what was expected and what was at stake. It reminds me of modern rituals where entire cities gather for parades or group runs, all tied to causes they barely understand but feel bound to anyway. People need shared moments. They need to believe their actions matter, even if it is just lying on grass with a stranger while the stars flicker overhead. Descriptions of these rituals survive in the accounts of travellers and in fragments of church records. One priest wrote of finding a field still warm with footprints and flattened grass. Another chronicler described clothes left on trees, fluttering in the morning wind. These details were recorded with both disgust and fascination. Even those who condemned the rituals could not ignore their power. Eventually, as laws tightened and beliefs changed, these gatherings became rarer. New roads brought in outsiders. Villages grew larger. Fields were fenced. But for a time, these shared acts tied communities together in a way few other things could. The rituals did not save every harvest. but they gave people a reason to believe, a reason to return each year, a reason to hold on. It is almost tender that people gave themselves to the land not with words or coins, but with skin and breath. In the cold dark before spring, when everything was uncertain, they chose to give what little warmth they had. In the next part, we move away from the fields and back into the home, where even looking at one's spouse too long could be seen as dangerous, because in some corners of medieval morality, a gaze held more power than a touch. As rules tightened around public behaviour and private rituals vanished into memory, women were left with fewer and fewer choices. In the brothels that lined the back streets of medieval towns, the focus was never on comfort or consent. It was a presentation. The way a woman smelled, moved, or looked could mean the difference between being chosen or ignored, and when all else failed, many were told to turn to fire, not literal fire, but something that burned just the same. A mixture of strong liquor, ground ginger, and crushed pepper. This was no luxury. There was no perfume. It was a punishment dressed up as preparation. The practice was often introduced by the madam or passed down from older workers. A woman new to the house would be shown the mixture without much explanation. The ingredients were simple. Strong alcohol, usually made from rye or barley, is mixed with a generous spoon of grated ginger root and a pinch of black pepper. Everything was stirred together in a wooden bowl, left uncovered, and used within a few hours. There were no measuring spoons, no precise ratios, just enough to sting. The woman would be handed a rag soaked in the mixture, sometimes warm, sometimes cold. She would press it between her legs, wincing at the contact. The pain was sharp, immediate, and familiar to every woman who had used it before. They did not complain aloud, they just clenched their teeth and got through it. Some applied it twice, believing the second time made the scent stronger. Others did it only when forced, but in many brothels, it was not a choice. It was part of the job. It is almost funny, in a bitter sort of way, that women were told to burn their own skin so someone else might find them more appealing. The idea was that the mixture masked any natural scent and left behind a scent that men would mistake for arousal. Some even believed it made the body tighter or more responsive. These claims were never tested. They were simply accepted. The damage built up quickly. The first time might leave a red patch. By the third or fourth, the skin began to blister. Some women developed raw, open wounds. Others lost sensation completely, which was sometimes called a blessing and sometimes a curse. Infections were common. Medical care was rare. A few women tried to soothe the area with cold water or herbs after work, but the damage was usually done. Still, the routine continued. In some houses, the mixture was kept in a covered pot near the washing basin. It was applied before the first client and sometimes between visits. If a man complained about a smell, even if imagined, the woman was blamed. She would be sent back to the basin, another cloth, another burn, and no one asked whether the man's own body had anything to do with it. I think this shows how pain was disguised as professionalism. Women were not offered tools to care for themselves. They were given instructions to reshape themselves into something more acceptable, even if it meant harm. No one checked if the mixture worked. They just enforced it. The ingredients had their own stories. Ginger was known to warm the body and increase circulation. Pepper was believed to stimulate heat and drive out illness. Liquor, of course, was used for everything. Disinfection, ritual, courage. When combined, the three created a concoction that felt like fire. But instead of curing disease or warding off evil, it punished the most sensitive parts of the body, not because of dirt or illness, but because of men's preferences. That was the real target. The practice was not limited to brothels, it spread through whispers. Some married women heard of it from cousins or friends and tried it at home. They were told it would make their husbands more attentive, more passionate, more willing to stay. So they grated ginger behind closed doors, crushed pepper with the bottom of a jar, and added liquor taken from a kitchen shelf. The burn surprised them. but they thought it meant it was working. A few midwives warned against it. They saw the sores and infections. They treated women who could no longer sit without pain. They suggested gentler methods, warm water, soft cloth, herbs that soothed instead of scorched. But the advice was not always heard. In places where choices were few and voices were ignored, fire often seemed more powerful than kindness. It is disturbing how easily something harmful can be repackaged as a beauty routine. There were no books or rules, just stories. One woman said it worked, another repeated it, and soon it became true. The mixtures changed slightly from town to town. Some added mint to mask the smell, others used vinegar instead of liquor. In one region, cloves were included, giving the blend a sharp sweetness, but the result was always the same. A moment of heat, a sharp intake of breath, a stinging reminder that the body was not your own. There were no proper records of the practice. No one wrote recipes or instructions. It lived in the hands and rags of women who learned from pain, and it vanished just as quietly, over time, as better options appeared, as brothels changed, as old habits faded. The cloths soaked in pepper and alcohol were thrown out. But for centuries, they were part of daily life for many women, unspoken, unquestioned, endured. Some women found ways to resist. They faked the burn by rubbing their skin with warm water and pretending to wince. They added flour to the mixture to dull the sting. A few refused entirely, choosing punishment over pain. These small acts did not change the system, but they gave the women something to hold on to. It is heartbreaking that so many had to choose between burning and being unwanted. No one should have to injure themselves to be considered acceptable. But in places where someone else's satisfaction was measured, injury became part of the job. Next, we will leave the brothels behind and walk into the churches, where the rules of the body were replaced with rules of the soul. But even there, the fear of touch and temptation shaped every step and every glance. Even in places where women were expected to be silent, they found ways to speak without words, in the kitchens, behind curtains, and under the sound of boiling pots. Quiet customs continued that had nothing to do with saints or sermons. One of the most secret and most feared of these involved something many men pretended not to understand. It was not a charm or a potion sold in the market. It was something that came from within. Menstrual blood, known for its taboo and power, was believed in some regions to hold a unique force, and some women were taught that just a few drops of it could bind a man's heart. The method was simple, but hidden. A wife or lover would wait until the second or third day of her cycle, collect a few drops onto a cloth, and then dry it. Once dry, the blood was scraped or wrung into a cup of wine or stirred into warm food. Not enough to change the taste, just enough to be swallowed without notice. Some used soup, others preferred bread dipped in sauce. The meal would be served with a smile, and the woman would watch silently, waiting for the last bite to disappear. She would not speak of it, not to friends, not to the man, not even to her children. This was a secret passed only from mother to daughter, usually once the daughter had reached womanhood or faced her trouble with a wandering husband. The lesson came with warnings. Never tell anyone. Never use it in anger. Always clean the bowl afterward. Some mothers even gave their daughters special cloths stitched with red thread, meant only for this use. The belief was that menstrual blood carried not only the essence of the woman, but her control. It was thought to enter the man's body, move through his thoughts, and return to her with loyalty. A man who consumed it would think of her more often, stay home more nights, and forget the scent of other women. In some areas, it was said that the blood could protect against infidelity, jealousy, and bad spirits that caused division in the household. It is hard not to chuckle at the idea that a spoonful of soup could become a loyalty trap, but people have done stranger things for love, and in a world where women had no say in law or property, controlling a man's attention through a secret drop of blood felt like reclaiming something. Some midwives supported the practice. They believed menstrual blood held warmth and could fix an imbalance in a man's spirit. Others warned against it, saying it was too dangerous if misused. A few healers mixed it with herbs to create stronger versions. Basil for calmness, rosemary for memory, garlic for protection. But the most common form remained simple. Blood, dried or fresh, is added to food and swallowed in silence. This act was never spoken of in confession. No woman dared bring it to the ear of a priest. To admit such a thing would risk more than judgment. It could lead to accusations of witchcraft. The church viewed menstrual blood as impure, even dangerous. To use it for influence or desire would be labelled demonic. But the practice continued anyway, hidden behind ladles and quiet eyes. I think this reveals just how resourceful women became when every other path was blocked. They didn't poison, they did not scream. They stirred, waited, and hoped. It was not revenge, it was maintenance. A way to hold together something already fraying. Not all women used the practice for love. Some did it out of fear. A neighbour had lost her husband to a younger girl. A cousin had been beaten after refusing her husband's demands. These stories travelled. They became warnings, and the blood became a tool, a line of defence, something to carry in silence. In one village, it was said that a woman used it every month for 7 years, and her husband never once missed supper. Whether true or not, the story was told with pride. There were rules. The blood had to come from the woman herself. It could not be borrowed or shared. It had to be fresh or dried naturally, never heated. Some believed it worked best during a full moon. Others said it must be done before the first crow called in the morning. These rules varied, but they gave the act weight. It became more than just an ingredient. It became a ritual. Sometimes the woman kept a journal, not with full sentences, but with marks. A red dot for the day she added it to his wine, a blue line for the days he stayed home. Over time, the journal became a quiet record of successes and failures. When the marks changed, the woman adjusted. She switched recipes, used honey instead of oil, bread instead of soup. The blood remained the same. It is strangely touching that so much care and precision went into an act no one else would ever know had happened. No thanks, no recognition. Just an invisible effort, made with hope. In rare cases, the man found out. A stain on a cloth, a smell in the pot, a whispered rumour. Reactions varied. Some men flew into rage, throwing food and making threats. Others were confused, unsure what it meant. A few said nothing at all, but began to eat more carefully, asking more questions, watching her more closely, but most never noticed. They continued eating, drinking, and sleeping, unaware that part of their loyalty may have come from a secret drop in the wine. Today, such acts might seem unthinkable, but in that time, they were just part of the fabric of quiet survival. A woman used what she had, and sometimes what she had was hidden within her, wrapped in cloth, waiting for the right moment. It is unsettling and yet somehow understandable how something considered shameful was transformed into a gesture of care. The world offered so little control, so the women reached for what was left. Next, we will explore another form of silent punishment, where women considered too eager were not whispered about, but physically burned by stones meant to cool the heat of their desire. There were rules governing every aspect of life in medieval convents: how to walk, how to eat, how to pray. But beneath those rules, there were others, quieter and crueler, meant only for certain women. These rules were not written on paper or carved into stone. They were passed from one nun to another, whispered behind doors, and acted out in silence. One of the harshest was used on women who were considered too eager, too expressive, or simply too alive. They were labelled as consumed by lust, even if they had done nothing more than blush or ask the wrong question. For these women, discipline came in the form of fire hidden in stone. The method was simple and chilling. A large flat stone was taken from near the hearth or the kitchen oven, heated slowly until its surface became too hot to touch. The woman, stripped of her outer clothing, was made to lie flat on her back. The nun in charge of discipline would place the heated stone directly on her bare stomach, usually above the navel. There were no straps, no binding. The heat alone was unthinkable. The woman would clench her teeth, close her eyes, and endure. Sometimes the stone was wrapped in a thin cloth. Other times it was placed directly on the skin, depending on the severity of the so-called offence. The pain was not sharp like a blade. It was slow, deep, and lasting. Red patches would form, sometimes blisters. Scars followed in many cases, but the punishment was not meant to wound the body alone. It was meant to crush the spirit. It is ironic that to remove desire, they used an act so intimate and violating. The placement of the stone, the silence of the punishment, and the pain that followed all spoke of control, not healing. This was never about care, it was about submission. The idea behind the ritual was that excessive heat inside a woman's body caused sinful thoughts. Lust was seen as a kind of fever, especially in women. The solution, in their eyes, was to draw the heat out by applying more heat on the outside, like fighting fire with fire. It sounds ridiculous now, but in their world, it passed for logic. In some cases, the punishment included prayer. Psalms were read aloud by other nuns as the stone rested on the woman's abdomen. Sometimes the punished woman was forced to repeat words of repentance, her voice trembling from pain. When you compare it to today, it's like giving someone an ice bath for daydreaming. But back then, a woman's thoughts were not her own, and her body was subject to judgment from people who claimed to protect her soul. The punishments were usually done in private. Only the superior and one or two assistants would be present. But word travelled fast in such tight communities. Everyone knew when the stones had been heated. Everyone saw the limp walk or pale face afterward, and they understood. There was no need to explain. Punishments like this were most common in strict convents or houses where young girls had been sent by force. Some had been orphaned, others were too poor to marry. A few had simply been too curious, too clever, too difficult. In a society where women had few choices, convents became places of both refuge and repression. There were kind sisters, of course, and many who offered comfort. But even kindness could not erase the stone's memory. I think these rituals show just how far fear of female emotion could go. Instead of helping women understand themselves, they were taught to fear their own warmth. Instead of being the tools to grow, they were handed stones to burn away their nature. Not all women accepted the punishment quietly. Some cried out, some tried to run. A few collapsed from the pain and had to be treated by the very people who had caused the injury. In rare cases, the punishment left permanent damage, scars that never faded. A twisted posture, internal bleeding, but the practice continued. The stones were also symbolic. They reminded the women that their bodies were never fully theirs. Even in a place of supposed holiness, their skin could be touched, pressed, scorched, without consent. The act was justified not by law or reason, but by belief, and belief is harder to question than rules. Sometimes, the ritual was adapted. In colder regions, ice was used instead to cool the fire of lust. It was placed inside a cloth and held between the legs for several minutes. The result was numbness, discomfort, and the same message: your desire is a threat, and we will remove it by force if necessary. Older nuns often passed down the stone punishment with a stern face and steady hands. Some believed in it deeply. Others simply followed what had been done to them years before. It became a cycle. Hurt passed down in the name of holiness. In some rare accounts, a punished woman later rose to lead the convent herself, and in a few such stories she quietly ended the tradition. She placed the stones back into the hearth and left them there. But these were exceptions. Most of the time, the practice faded only when reforms reached the walls. or when outsiders began asking questions. It is hard to imagine how many women suffered in silence for simply feeling what they were told not to. Their names are gone now. Their pain left no records, but the stones speak, if we choose to listen. Now, we turn from convents to courts, where other kinds of judgments waited for women accused not of thought, but of action, and where punishment was no longer symbolic, but delivered in public, under the eyes of the crowd. In some corners of medieval society, there was a method believed to reveal the truth about a woman's chastity. It did not involve questions, witnesses, or understanding. Instead, it involved fire. The ritual, crude and terrifying, began with an iron blade and ended with the smell of burned flesh. The logic behind it was simple in the eyes of those who practiced it. If a woman were pure, untouched, and innocent, then the heated blade would not harm her skin. If the skin blistered, she was guilty. No medical explanation could sway their beliefs. No resistance could spare her from the test. It began in the same way every time. A small gathering was called, usually by local religious leaders or members of a court. The woman would be summoned to a public or semi-private place, depending on the severity of the accusation. A fire would be lit, and the iron blade, sometimes a knife or a sword, was placed directly into the flames. The crowd would watch it darken, then glow, until it turned a dangerous shade of red. That red was the colour of judgment. When the blade was ready, she was told to hold out her arm, hand, or leg, depending on the region's custom. Some versions of the ritual required her to walk a certain distance carrying the hot blade in her bare hands. Others only needed her to withstand a single touch, but the result was the same. If her skin stayed smooth, she was declared innocent. If blisters rose, she was guilty. The absurdity of relying on a piece of burning metal to determine someone's innocence was never questioned by those in charge. People believed that divine power would protect the pure. The test was called an ordeal, and it was not limited to women accused of sexual activity. It was used in cases of theft, lies, and even heresy. But when it came to female sexuality, the consequences were especially severe. Failing the test meant more than pain. It meant social exile, humiliation, and in some cases forced penance or confinement. The woman had no say. Refusing the test was seen as an admission of guilt. Some collapsed before the blade even touched them. Others trembled so violently that holding still was impossible. But those reactions were not interpreted as fear. They were seen as signs of impurity. The system was designed to confirm suspicion, not to investigate it. If modern trials were conducted this way, we'd be heating spoons and branding people in courtrooms. And yet, for many communities, this was not a fringe practice. It was accepted as part of moral discipline. Even when it failed, it was rarely questioned. If a woman passed the test, it was called a miracle. If she failed, it was labelled justice. The idea behind it came from a blend of religious and folk beliefs. Fire, in their eyes, was a purifier, and purity of the body was tied directly to worth. Her supposed innocence measured a woman's value. Her ability to marry, to live freely, to be believed, all depended on this single concept. That was why such harsh measures were justified, or so they claimed. In some cases, the test was not done by strangers but by family. A father might demand it if he heard rumours about his daughter. A husband might require it of a new bride. There were even stories of noblemen using it to punish female servants who dared speak out. The blade became a tool of silence as much as punishment. After the test, the wound was inspected. In some places, they waited 3 days to check for blisters. A clean wound meant divine protection. A blister, no matter how small, confirmed shame. There was no consideration for the science of heat or the biology of skin. They did not understand how temperature and pressure caused damage. They did not care. I think what haunts me most is how easily pain was mistaken for proof. Records from the time describe these ordeals in dry language. They list names, dates, and outcomes, but they do not speak of the screaming, the smell, or the shaking hands. They do not record the looks on the faces of the accused or how they slept the night before. These details are lost, but they can be imagined, and once imagined, they cannot be forgotten. In some places, the ritual evolved. Instead of an open flame, a heated stone was used. Instead of public viewing, it was done in small rooms with only a priest present. These changes did not make the act more merciful. They only made it quieter. The blade was still hot. The logic is still flawed. By the late Middle Ages, the practice began to decline. Legal reforms slowly replaced superstitious trials with witness-based proceedings, but traces of the ordeal remained in rural areas. It took generations before the ritual disappeared entirely. Even then, the belief that women must prove their purity never fully vanished. It simply changed form. Some versions of the ordeal required women to confess before the blade was used. This confession, often extracted under pressure or from fear, was used to spare them from the burn. But the shame remained. She had admitted impurity, and that was enough for punishment. The test had worked. They claimed. Today, we would call this torture, not justice, and we would be right. But in its time, it was considered holy. That contrast is hard to accept. What is perhaps most chilling is the quietness of it. The blade did not scream. The woman did not always cry. Sometimes she simply held out her hand and endured. The crowd watched, nodded, and moved on. There was no ceremony, no apology, just fire and skin. Stories survive of women who passed the test and were celebrated for it. They were held up as examples of virtue. But one wonders what they carried inside after such an ordeal. What fear, what memory, what change. No blade touches skin without leaving a mark. I sometimes wonder how many of those women believed in the blade themselves. Did they pray for it to spare them, or did they know from the start that they would burn? As we leave behind this brutal method, we move into the realm of deception, where cloth and thread replaced fire. A new kind of ritual awaited, softer in appearance but no less tied to desire and fear. In some areas of medieval Europe, marriage was not entirely a private matter. For some couples, the bedroom was not their own. Instead, it came with a spiritual supervisor. The church, holding both authority and suspicion, sought to ensure that intimacy was conducted in accordance with religious norms. This meant that sex should only occur within marriage, only in approved positions, and only with the intent to produce children. Anything outside of that narrow path was seen as sinful or even dangerous. To enforce this, certain parishes introduced a practice that feels invasive even by medieval standards. They asked couples to report their sexual activity to their local priest. It did not happen everywhere, and not all clergy demanded it. But where it did occur, it turned something personal into something monitored. Married couples were asked to meet with a cleric, usually in a confessional or private chamber, and describe when they last had relations. The questions were detailed. What night? At what hour? In what manner? Was it a fertile time of the month? Was the aim to conceive? The more devout the region, the more intense the scrutiny. This practice stemmed from the belief that sex was inherently sinful unless purified by purpose. And the only pure purpose was reproduction. Any act done for pleasure alone risked leading the soul astray. Priests, in theory, offered guidance to keep couples on the right path. In practice, they often became record keepers of private habits. Some even kept logs, listing dates and details. Imagine having to file a tax return for your sex life, complete with footnotes and moral disclaimers. That was the level of control in some areas. Couples who failed to comply could be fined, denied communion, or labelled impure. In extreme cases, they were ordered to do penance, which could include fasting, prayer, or public confession. There were specific days on which sex was absolutely forbidden. Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, and times of mourning were considered sacred. Having relations during those periods was said to defile the holiness of the calendar. The priest's job, in this context, was to prevent such offences, but enforcement often went beyond dates. He might ask if both parties had consented, if they had bathed beforehand, or if the position used was considered acceptable. Missionary was generally allowed. Anything else was suspect. Some parishes distributed calendars with approved days marked. Couples were told to follow these strictly. The idea was to regulate bodies the way one might regulate the harvest or prayer times. I sometimes wonder how much intimacy survived in a world where desire had to be scheduled like a church festival. The rules varied. In some places, the guidance was gentle, more suggestion than mandate. In others, it was rigid. There are records of couples being punished for omitting details or delaying reports. Privacy was not respected the way it is now. There was no concept of bodily autonomy. The church was seen as the guardian of both the soul and the flesh. Most of this applies to common people. Nobles and clergy themselves were rarely subjected to the same level of oversight. Wealth and position often protected them. For peasants and small-town families, though, the rules were applied more directly. A baker and his wife could find themselves summoned for questioning, while the local baron was left alone. Clergy often framed this as spiritual care. They were helping couples avoid sin, protecting them from damnation. But behind that concern was control. Regulating sexual behaviour was a way to maintain social order. It reminded people that even their most private actions belonged to the church. Confessional records from the time occasionally reflect the discomfort people felt. Some confessed without detail, hoping to avoid further questions. Others lied outright. There are notes from priests complaining that couples were not honest, that they seemed evasive or ashamed. But rather than seeing this as a sign of overreach, the clergy often saw it as proof of guilt. Some priests pushed this further, offering direct instructions. Some told couples how often to engage in relations, or what prayers to say before and after. They advised on timing, on positions, even on clothing. Sex became another ritual, filled with caution and rules. It's not hard to draw a parallel to today's surveillance culture, where even private data can be tracked and judged. The difference is that medieval people had no choice and no privacy laws. Their compliance was a matter of faith, not convenience. In a few cases, women bore the brunt of this scrutiny. If a couple failed to conceive, the wife was often blamed. She might be accused of harbouring impure thoughts, of resisting her husband's advances, or of engaging in forbidden practices. Some women were ordered to confess separately. The priest would then compare their accounts to look for inconsistencies. Couples who admitted to using any form of birth control were punished harshly. Even the use of herbal mixtures or timing avoidance was condemned. The church did not tolerate anything that stood in the way of reproduction. Sex was to be tied directly to childbirth, no matter the consequences. There were also psychological effects. People began to internalize the idea that desire itself was suspect. If a man felt arousal at the wrong time, he might rush to confess. If a woman experienced pleasure, she might feel guilty. The bedroom became another place of judgment. What should have been a connection turned into an obligation. Over time, some of these practices faded. The Reformation changed attitudes. Different sects loosened or hardened the rules depending on doctrine, but the echoes remained. Even in later centuries, the clergy still held influence over how couples thought about intimacy. The idea that sex needed approval did not die quickly. Looking back, I feel more sorrow than shock. These were people trying to live, to love, and to stay faithful in a world that never let them breathe freely. Their stories remind us that even the most natural parts of life can become complicated when controlled by fear. As we leave behind the priest's ledger and step into the next realm, we enter the world of rituals performed not for guidance, but for protection. Here, women clung to charms and cloth not to seek approval, but to keep their partners from leaving. By medieval standards, infidelity was more than a personal betrayal. It was a disruption to the social fabric, a potential threat to lineage, inheritance, and honour. But rather than dealing with such matters in quiet family circles, some communities turned punishment into a public spectacle. Adultery, particularly when discovered by church officials or reported by neighbours, often led to shame-based punishments designed not only to hurt but to humiliate. The goal was to serve as a warning to others, and the methods used were as creative as they were cruel. For men who were caught being unfaithful, there was one specific punishment that stood out in its mixture of pain and mockery. A metal ring was locked around the man's genitals. Attached to this ring were small bells that jingled with every movement. The sound wasn't for decoration. It was a signal, a noise designed to draw attention to his shame as he was paraded through town. Each step rang out his offence. Each turn of his hips reminded onlookers of what he had done. The spectacle didn't end there. Some were made to wear additional signs, wooden placards, or tall hats inscribed with words like traitor or cheater. Often these men were forced to march through markets or fairs, where the crowds were dense and the laughter loud. The punishment turned private failure into public theatre. It's hard to decide what hurt more, the chafing metal or the scornful eyes of the villagers. Women were not spared either. While the church generally imposed harsher moral expectations on women, the punishments they faced often targeted discomfort over visibility. A common form was forcing the accused woman to wear undergarments made of coarse horsehair or thistles. These materials caused itching, burning, and abrasions, especially when worn tightly beneath the skin. The garments would be worn under their clothes, visible to the eye but impossible to forget. Sometimes they were soaked in vinegar or brine to increase the pain. Other times, women were dressed in humiliating costumes, made to stand on platforms or walk through the town square while people jeered. They might be forced to carry symbolic objects like cracked eggs or broken rings to suggest their moral failure. In rare cases, they were tied to carts and rolled slowly around the village while being pelted with rotten produce. It wasn't justice so much as entertainment, with pain sold as virtue and public cruelty mistaken for moral clarity. This kind of punishment served a social function. It let the crowd participate in enforcing moral order. It gave people the illusion of superiority. Even those with their own secrets could laugh, so long as someone else was on the stage. In some regions, especially in smaller towns where everyone knew each other, the humiliation stuck for life. The bells might stop ringing, but the memory never faded. Children would grow up remembering the day their neighbour walked past with a metal ring. Women would cross the street when the exiled girl came to market. These moments became part of village memory, retold as cautionary tales. Clergy were often the ones overseeing these punishments. They preached about moral decay and the importance of fidelity. But their interest wasn't only spiritual. The church was deeply invested in controlling marriage and sexual behaviour. Public punishment helped maintain that control. It reminded people that even the most private acts could be subject to inspection. There are even records of adultery trials held in church courtyards. The accused would be brought forward, accusations read aloud, and evidence laid bare. In some cases, the evidence was nothing more than rumour. A neighbour's suspicion or a servant's tale could lead to a public judgment, and once punishment was ordered, few dared to object. Men sometimes tried to bribe their way out of the sentence, offering livestock or goods to the priest or local officials. Occasionally, it worked. Wealth could buy silence, or at least a milder sentence. But poor villagers had no such protection. For them, shame was the only currency they were allowed to pay. Modern scandal culture isn't much different in spirit. It just uses screens instead of bells, and headlines instead of whips. The appetite for exposing others, especially when it comes to sex and betrayal, remains curiously strong. One curious detail is that some of these punishments were passed down from older traditions. Long before Christianity formalised moral codes, pagan communities had their own ways of punishing adultery. Sometimes these rituals involved symbolic cleansing or temporary exile. What the church did was take those ideas and make them harsher, wrapping pain in the language of penance. In households where power was uneven, these punishments became tools for control. A husband who suspected his wife could report her for adultery even without proof. Once accused, she would find it hard to defend herself. The reverse was less common. Women had fewer opportunities to bring formal accusations. This imbalance meant that adultery punishments often reflected gender biases as much as moral concerns. It is telling that some communities built wooden stocks specifically shaped for these punishments. Carved holes, custom-made clamps, and humiliating signposts were prepared and kept ready. That suggests a system not built for justice, but for regular performance. Punishments varied depending on region, wealth, and the priest's mood. In some places, first-time offenders were spared public shame but had to fast for days or sleep outside the home. In others, even suspicion was enough for parade and ridicule. There were also towns where people embraced such punishments as part of public festivals. During certain feast days, those accused of sexual sins were brought forward not for repentance but for mockery, becoming part of games and competitions. Looking back, I find these scenes both absurd and grim. They show how far people would go to protect appearances, even if it meant ruining someone's life for a mistake. The line between justice and spectacle blurred quickly when crowds gathered and laughter echoed. As we step away from the square and its clanging bells, the story takes a quieter turn. In the next part, we'll look at one of the strangest beliefs of all, the idea that divine punishment could be measured by heat and flesh. In medieval belief, the body was not just a vessel but a symbol, a moral battlefield where every gesture could mean something more than just emotion. Among the many odd customs and judgments of that time, the left hand earned a reputation it never quite deserved. It was called unclean, associated with dark forces, and distrusted in everything from eating to prayer. When it came to intimate acts, especially between a man and his partner, using the left hand was considered more than strange. It was spiritually dangerous. The term the devil's hand was not just a saying. Many people truly believed the left side of the body was vulnerable to evil influence, while the right hand was used for blessings, greetings, and respectable gestures. The left was meant to be hidden, controlled, or avoided. This belief affected how people behaved in daily life, but it also crept into the bedroom. In some communities, it was considered inappropriate, even sinful, for a man to touch his wife with his left hand during intimate moments. That hand was not trusted to express love or desire. It was the hand of secrecy and shame. Religious teaching did not always write this down clearly, but sermons, folklore, and domestic traditions passed it on. Young boys were taught early to favour their right hand. Left-handedness itself was corrected harshly. If a boy reached for food with the wrong hand, he could be slapped. If he used that hand to touch a girl's shoulder, the punishment might be worse. It was almost like being left-handed was a moral flaw instead of just a natural difference. Many families used physical methods to correct this so-called error. Tying the left hand at night was common. Some children were made to wear gloves, or hold objects in their right hand all day so they would grow used to using it. In religious schools, left-handed writing was often forbidden. The pressure to conform affected self-esteem, body awareness, and relationships later in life. Among married couples, the rule of the right hand became part of unwritten expectations. Wives were taught to expect a respectful, orderly type of affection. If a husband reached out with his left, it might be seen as crude or uncontrolled. This was especially true in more conservative regions. In some places, women reported such behaviour to the parish priest. A man might be called in for private correction or even public penance if he ignored the warning. The act was not treated as violence, but as a sign of disorder in the home. In public, gestures were watched closely. A man who greeted a woman with his left hand could be accused of rudeness or worse. Dancers were sometimes punished if they extended their left hand during a ceremonial movement. In some villages, there were even festivals where left-handed men were mocked or forced to perform embarrassing tasks to cleanse their habits. Imagine if every left swipe on a phone today led to a fine or a sermon. That's how strict the logic could be. This idea extended to young people as well. Boys approaching girls had to be careful not to appear too forward, especially with the wrong hand. Even touching a hand accidentally with the left could cause whispers. A left-handed touch in a moment of innocence might be twisted into something indecent. In that world, appearances mattered more than intention. In brothels and taverns, the rule existed in its own form. Sex workers often refused service to clients who insisted on using their left hand. They believed it brought bad luck or carried impure energy. Some establishments had specific customs or gestures that discouraged any behaviour involving the left. Even among people who bent many other rules, this one held its ground. For a naturally left-handed man, navigating desire could feel like walking a tightrope. To please his partner, to avoid suspicion, to stay in line with the moral teachings of his village, he had to suppress instinct. Over time, this may have made men feel detached from their own bodies. One hand was good, the other was shameful. I sometimes wonder how many people lived their lives feeling broken simply because of which side they favoured. Medical writings of the time did not help. Some claimed that using the left hand drained vitality or weakened the spirit. Others said that such behaviour could harm a man's fertility. There were remedies offered. Of course, herbal teas to strengthen the right hand, prayers to correct left-leaning thoughts, even amulets to be worn on the left wrist, designed to balance the soul. Among the upper classes, tutors were brought in to train noble boys in correct posture and touch. These lessons went beyond etiquette. They were part of moral development. A well-raised boy knew how to hold a spoon, how to shake a hand, and how to express affection, all with the proper side. This instruction continued into adulthood. Knights, priests, and merchants all lived under the same code. Of course, not everyone agreed. In more rural or open-minded areas, people cared less about which hand did what. But even there, superstition had its hold. In times of disaster or illness, people still looked for a cause, and when no other explanation could be found, strange behaviours like touching with the left hand often became targets of blame. It's almost funny, really, how something so small could carry so much fear and weight. But fear ruled medieval thinking. The fear of sin, of impurity, of social exclusion. Every part of life was built on rules that kept chaos away. Sometimes those rules helped. Often, they just created more confusion. The tradition faded slowly. As religious teaching softened and medical understanding grew, people began to let go of this obsession. But for hundreds of years, the simple act of reaching out with one hand or the other carried meaning that went far beyond skin. It touched the spirit. It defined right and wrong. Looking back, I think this fixation was less about holiness and more about control. Controlling hands, minds, bodies, and lives. That was the real goal, and it worked. It shaped generations. Soon, though, we move from hands to fluids. The next practice involves a strange belief in the potential of certain bodily fluids and why people went to great lengths to collect and consume them. In certain corners of medieval religious life, spiritual hunger took strange forms. For some individuals, the connection with the divine was not just a matter of prayer or meditation, it became physical. Some believed that by touching their flesh to a statue, especially a statue of a saint or divine figure, they could bring themselves closer to heaven. This act was not always done in secret, and it was not always meant to be profane. For many, it was seen as a kind of religious ecstasy, a private ritual that blurred the line between spirit and body. Reports and legends from the period suggest that people approached these statues not only with reverence, but also with desire. These figures, often life-sized, cold to the touch, and made of stone or wood, stood at the edge of sacred and forbidden. Worshippers who were unable to touch the divine in their prayers sometimes took more literal steps. They visited shrines alone at night. They removed parts of their clothing. They pressed themselves against the surface of the statue, sometimes embracing it or lying against it in what they believed was a moment of divine union. In some churches, the wear on certain statues became noticeable. The lower portions, especially the pelvic areas, began to show strange signs of erosion. Pilgrims would stroke, kiss, or rub the statues in very specific places. These were not accidents, in places where fertility was a concern, or where local stories tied a saint to physical healing. People took matters into their own hands. They believed the stone held power, and by mingling their body with it, they could receive a blessing or a cure. If this sounds like something out of an extraordinary modern art exhibit, that's because the boundary between devotion and obsession has always been thinner than we like to admit. Church authorities were not always aware of these acts. Many of them occurred at night or in remote chapels, but over time, complaints and stories surfaced. Clergy found evidence of bodily fluids near the statues. Candles were found burnt down to wax puddles, along with scraps of fabric and sometimes broken rosaries. In some cases, church custodians began to notice that statues required repair far more often than expected. The response was swift in some regions. Statues were covered with cloth during off hours. Metal grates were added in front of the niches. In extreme cases, particularly sensual statues were removed entirely. Some churches altered the designs, carving robes or armour to cover the once exposed forms. It reminds me a bit of how modern museums now have to put barriers in front of famous art, not because people are evil, but because temptation comes in odd forms. The motivations behind these rituals varied. Some believed they could receive visions through this contact. Others thought they might conceive a child blessed by the divine. Still others sought to cleanse themselves of sin by uniting with a holy object. In an age where literacy was low and most theology was passed through images and objects, it is perhaps not surprising that statues carried such emotional and spiritual weight. Among women, especially, there was a belief in certain areas that touching or lying against a statue of a male saint could help with fertility issues. They would make quiet pilgrimages, sometimes with midwives or older relatives. The ritual was whispered down from mother to daughter. Instructions were not written but passed along through behaviour and memory. Candles were lit. Oils were applied. The act was slow, methodical, and deeply private. For many, it was not seen as dirty or sinful. It was an act of desperation, of hope, of reaching for something beyond human limits. But not all acts were so benign. Some people became obsessed. They returned to the same statue day after day. Some stripped naked inside the church. A few were even caught in the act by clergy or fellow worshippers. Punishments varied, from public confession to banishment. In particularly strict regions, individuals were accused of heresy or even demonic possession. Statues became the centre of debates among theologians. Should they inspire love or fear? Should the faithful be allowed to touch them at all? Some religious writers argue that the problem was not the statue but the people. Others claim the devil used the likeness of the holy to trick weak minds. In response, rules were set about where and how statues could be displayed. Some churches began using images painted on walls instead, believing they were less likely to provoke improper behaviour. I think this all says more about human loneliness than anything else. When people have no outlet for affection or spiritual longing, they find one, even if it is carved from stone. In some places, artists were instructed to make saints look less human. Faces were made more expressionless. Bodies were hidden under exaggerated folds of fabric. Statues were raised on tall pedestals, far out of reach. Still, stories continued. In private, people touched these forms. They left behind signs of their visit. The relationship between human and image remained unresolved. It is tempting to dismiss all this as madness or misinterpretation, but to do so misses the point. These practices were not about sex in the modern sense. They were about connection, transformation, and longing. The boundaries between sacred and profane have always shifted. In a world where the divine was everywhere, even a statue could become a doorway. Sometimes I wonder whether those statues ever seem to respond. Not literally, of course, but in the way that deep yearning can make anything feel alive. The church eventually silenced most of these practices, but the need they filled never went away. People still seek union, transcendence, and meaning in physical ways. The stone may no longer be the object, but the desire remains. And as we move forward, the next practice reveals how people tried to control and preserve that desire, not through objects of worship, but through the hidden rituals of the body itself. In some of the most remote and misunderstood corners of medieval society, a strange kind of ritual appeared in local traditions. It involved marrying a human to an animal. This was not done out of affection or desire, but rather as part of a broader belief in spiritual cleansing. In a time when mental illness was widely feared and rarely understood, people thought evil spirits or curses caused such conditions. In these cases, the supposed cure was not medication or therapy. It was a symbolic wedding. The person believed to be possessed was forced to participate in a mock marriage ceremony, and the chosen partner was often a farm animal. The idea behind the ritual was that the evil spirit or moral corruption would transfer from the person to the animal. Once the marriage took place, the animal might be led away, sometimes even sacrificed. In more disturbing accounts, the ritual included intimate gestures between the human and the animal, meant to seal the cleansing. While the ceremony was said to be symbolic, those involved were often humiliated or traumatized. These events were not organized in major cities or recognized by the church, but took place in isolated communities where superstition had more power than doctrine. What's most unsettling is that the community often treated the event as a spectacle. The individual believed to be possessed would be dressed in wedding attire. Villagers would gather. There was music, feasting, and rituals spoken aloud by a local priest or spiritual leader. Sometimes the animal was made to wear a ribbon or cloth to mark it as the bride or groom. The wedding was treated with a bizarre mix of seriousness and mockery. To outsiders, it would have looked like a cruel joke, but to those who performed it, this was a real attempt to heal. It's hard not to see this as medieval reality TV, except no one could turn it off or walk away. The animal chosen for the ritual varied depending on the region and the illness. Goats were common, especially in areas where goats were already seen as symbols of the devil. Pigs and donkeys were used in other cases. There were also instances where dogs or sheep became part of the ceremony. Sometimes the animal had already been linked to the afflicted person through dreams, behaviour, or coincidence. People believed that if a sick person stared too long at a goat or laughed when a pig squealed, that might be a sign of spiritual connection. The belief in transferring spirits was not new. Across medieval Europe, practices existed that aimed to pass sin or sickness into objects or animals. What made this practice different was how public and ritualized it became. The presence of formal vows, symbolic gestures, and sometimes even rings turned it into something theatrical. In a way, it resembled how modern society turns real suffering into performance. Just swap the church courtyard for a TV studio and a goat for a viral video. The church officially condemned these practices when they became known. There are records from the 14th century of bishops issuing orders to stop such ceremonies. However, because these events took place far from church centres, enforcement was slow. In some cases, clergy may have turned a blind eye or even participated, especially if they believed it would alleviate the villagers' fears. Superstition had deep roots. When someone acted strangely, people wanted answers. They wanted to feel they had done something. And so, the wedding went ahead. Descriptions of the ceremonies suggest that the afflicted person was not given much choice. They were often restrained or encouraged to participate. Laughter from the crowd was common. At times, People even threw rice or chanted as if it were a real wedding. The blending of humour and cruelty was part of the event. It allowed people to cope with their fear. They didn't know what caused madness, but by turning it into a ritual, they could pretend they had some control. I find it hard to imagine what it felt like for the person at the centre of all this. Dressed up, mocked, tied to an animal, and told it would make them clean again. That's not healing. That's punishment with decorations. Sometimes the ceremony was followed by isolation. The person might be kept away from others for days. Food would be left at the door. The idea was to let the spirit settle into its new host. If the person behaved calmly afterward, the ritual was said to have worked. If not, they might be forced to repeat it or be subjected to even harsher treatments. These included being tied to a tree, submerged in water, or made to drink foul concoctions to force out the spirit. There is no evidence that these rituals cured anything, but they continued for centuries in quiet corners of Europe. They were passed down not in books but in practice. Grandmothers taught daughters, village elders explained it to younger priests, stories were shared around fires. As medicine and psychology advanced, these rituals slowly disappeared, but their legacy remained in the form of fear, silence, and shame. Some anthropologists believe these marriages were never about healing. Instead, there were ways to mark the afflicted person as other. By making them do something no one else would, the village created distance. That person was now marked, different, memorable. It kept fear contained. It lets others sleep at night. There's a strange irony here in trying to remove evil. They ended up creating cruelty, and they called it a cure. By the end of the 14th century, such weddings had largely vanished from public view. Laws and church decrees made them harder to justify. But the stories survived, sometimes as whispers, sometimes as cautionary tales. They remind us how far people will go when they fear what they do not understand. When knowledge fails, ritual takes over, and not all rituals are kind. As we move toward the final examples of these strange medieval customs, the next story reveals just how far people were willing to go to enforce morality, this time not through marriage, but through silence and surveillance. In medieval Europe, trust between spouses was not always built on affection or mutual respect. In some cases, it was secured quite literally, with metal and a key. One of the more persistent and controversial devices from this era was the iron chastity belt. Though its actual use is debated by historians, there are enough references, illustrations, and preserved artifacts to suggest that at least some men believed in locking their wives' bodies when they could not be physically present. The idea was simple and disturbing. A man, especially a noble or a merchant who had to travel for long periods, would place a locked iron contraption over his wife's pelvis, covering both the front and back. The belt would be secured with a key, which he would take with him or entrust to someone he considered loyal. The belt itself was made of iron or sometimes brass. It had holes for bodily functions, but was designed to be impossible to remove without the key. Some belts were even lined with sharp protrusions or small metal spikes that would cause discomfort or injury if tampered with. This was not just about guarding against infidelity. It was a declaration of ownership. The woman's body was considered property, and the belt was a physical sign of control. There are records indicating that in some towns, blacksmiths were known to craft these devices on demand. The belts were sometimes padded with cloth or leather, but this rarely prevented bruises, chafing, or infection. The idea of showing love by locking someone's crotch in a metal cage is a bit like giving flowers and then nailing the vase shut. Some women wore these belts for days or weeks. There were reports of skin infections, abrasions, and even cases where the belt had to be forcibly removed due to swelling or rust. The hygiene issues were obvious. There was no easy way to clean underneath, and bodily fluids would accumulate, leading to painful conditions. In cases where a husband gave the key to a priest or a monk, it was sometimes framed as a sacred trust. The wife's purity was not just her husband's concern, but a matter of divine order. These keys were often kept in locked boxes themselves or sealed in wax to prevent premature use. There were also stories of wives trying to trick the system. Some may have created wax or wood impressions of the lock to have duplicate keys made. Others may have found sympathetic allies who could remove and reattach the belt in secret. These attempts were risky. If discovered, the punishment could be severe. Women could be cast out, beaten, or subjected to public humiliation. Still, in a world where autonomy was rare for women, any small act of defiance became an act of resistance. If this were a modern relationship, it would be like giving your partner a tracking app, a surveillance drone, and a remote-controlled taser, then calling it romance. Most belts were likely symbolic. In many cases, men might have believed that the very threat of the device was enough to keep wives faithful. But symbolism only works when fear is strong. In communities where social norms were rigid and the church's teachings were absolute, even the idea of breaking the rules brought shame. Some texts describe women being tested for signs of tampering when their husbands returned. Some belts had seals that would crack if the device was opened. Others were inscribed with religious warnings or verses to frighten the wearer into obedience. I can't help but think of how dehumanizing it must have felt to live every day under the weight of metal, with no privacy, even in pain. That wasn't love. That was imprisonment with a blessing. Despite the grim reality, chastity belts became a subject of dark humour and fascination over time. In later centuries, they were displayed in museums as curiosities or featured in bawdy poems. People debated whether they were ever truly used or whether they were exaggerated legends. Yet, enough personal accounts, wills, and legal records mention them to suggest that at least in certain places and times, they were real. They may not have been as widespread as stories suggest, but for those who wore them, it did not matter how rare they were. One belt was enough. In some households, the belt was not forced on the woman, but rather insisted upon by the husband's family. Mothers-in-law or older relatives might pressure a young bride to wear it for the family's honour. There are even rare cases where the belt was given as a wedding gift, complete with a small chest for the key. In wealthier circles, the belts could be engraved or decorated with silver. In poorer communities, they were crude, hastily made, and brutal. The pain, however, was the same. Not all belts were worn for chastity. Some were created as torture devices during the Inquisitions or as punishment for promiscuity. These versions were designed to cause harm, not just to restrict access. Spikes and clamps were added. Victims were left for hours or days. These uses were not about preventing affairs, but about inflicting pain as a moral lesson. In this form, the belt moved from private shame to public punishment. Eventually, the Church distanced itself from these practices as views on sexuality, consent, and marriage evolved. The idea of locking someone's body lost support. Laws against such treatment were written in some regions. Still, the imagery of the chastity belt lingered. It became a symbol in art and literature, used to explore themes of control, trust, and violation. Even today, the term appears in jokes or metaphors, often without understanding the pain behind the real thing. As with many bizarre practices of the medieval world, the chastity belt was born from fear. Fear of unfaithfulness, fear of shame, fear of powerlessness, and when fear runs society, cruelty often follows. As we approach one of the final chapters in this unsettling tour, the next part brings us to a different kind of control, one where obedience was expected not by force, but by surveillance and silence. In the silent stone walls of medieval convents, where prayer echoed louder than footsteps, not all secrets stayed buried in scripture. Some of the most unexpected tales come from places that were supposed to be untouched by worldly desires. In certain monastic complexes, particularly where male and female sections were located close to one another, reports emerged of carefully concealed wall holes carved between private rooms. These were not random cracks or innocent architectural flaws. They were made deliberately, sometimes lined with smooth wood or cloth to avoid injury, and their purpose was deeply at odds with everything the cloistered life claimed to stand for. The design was simple and crude. A small hole was made at about waist or pelvic height in adjoining walls between monks' and nuns' quarters. At night, behind closed doors and under the cover of darkness, two individuals would approach from either side. They would not see each other's faces. They would not speak. However, physical contact, albeit limited, still occurred. The idea behind this strange ritual was rooted in a twisted notion of piety. By avoiding eye contact, conversation, or full physical presence, they believed they were somehow avoiding sin. This wasn't about love or affection. It was a strange mechanical solution for lust, wrapped in the illusion of spiritual cleanliness. It was like trying to justify stealing by keeping your eyes closed while taking the coin. Some confessions recorded by inquisitors or bishops mentioned that these wall holes were not widespread, but rather existed in certain neglected or poorly supervised monasteries. In some cases, they were discovered during surprise visits or inspections, a cracked section of wall covered by loose tapestry, a strange draught in an otherwise sealed chamber, or worst of all, signs of wear and polish in one particular spot that suggested frequent contact. The Church treated these cases with scandalized horror, and rightly so. But beneath that horror was also the reality that many of these convents were not as isolated or holy as they were expected to be. In rare documents, it was noted that some participants claimed it was not intercourse, but spiritual connection, and that they were not violating vows because they could not see or touch the other person directly. Of course, this justification did not stand in a formal inquiry. Punishments varied. Some nuns were transferred to harsher convents. Some monks were defrocked. In extreme cases, confinement or public penance was required. But in most cases, the response was to seal the wall and hide the scandal. Reputation was everything. A single rumour could ruin the standing of an entire religious institution. If this happened today, it would be like putting a privacy screen on a dating app and thinking it turns it into a confession booth. There is no way to measure how many convents use this method. Most religious orders denied that such things ever happened, and surviving evidence is scarce. But accounts from travellers, former clergy, and disciplinary records give us glimpses. Some even describe specific techniques, like using blankets or silence codes to time the meeting. Others mention jealousy between monks over access or preference, which eventually led to exposure. It was a dark mirror of the world they claimed to leave behind. Instead of freeing themselves from desire, they found new ways to indulge it quietly. I can't help but think about how lonely and confused someone must be to believe that sin only counts if you look it in the eye. In some instances, this ritualized wall contact was actually encouraged by heretical sects posing as monastic communities. These fringe groups twisted theology to serve their own rules. They claimed that releasing bodily urges was necessary to clear the soul of worldly obsession. A few went so far as to teach that not knowing your partner's identity added to the purity of the act. It turned intimacy into something more like an anonymous rite than a shared experience. Unsurprisingly, these sects were hunted down by church authorities, and most left behind little more than confusing fragments of doctrine and punishment records. The existence of these holes also reminds us of the fragile balance between repression and rebellion. Medieval religious life asked people to deny the most basic instincts. For some, this denial turned into spiritual strength. For others, it bred guilt, secrecy, and strange compromises. The hole in the wall was not just a physical passage. It was a symbol of the gap between doctrine and reality. What should have been walls of silence became corridors of whispered defiance. Interestingly, the architectural aftermath of these discoveries sometimes resulted in absurd solutions. Some monasteries reinforced walls with thicker stone, moved rooms to opposite wings, or banned any renovations that included joint surfaces. The idea was to remove temptation not by changing hearts, but by blocking access. But as always, Rules without understanding often lead to new workarounds. When faith becomes surveillance, cleverness finds a way to hide. Even the art of the period hints at these tensions. Some illustrations from later centuries show walls with strange patterns or dual shadows, possibly nodding to the legends. Folk stories told of nuns who bore secret children, or monks who lost their minds from guilt after years of silent wall rituals. Whether real or exaggerated, they show that the image of the perfect, obedient convent life was not as clean as painted glass might suggest. It would be easy to laugh or mock these practices now, but they came from people who were genuinely caught between desire and dogma. They lived lives where every emotion had a consequence, and every impulse had to be disguised as ritual or suffering. Their creativity was a survival mechanism, not a rebellion, but in the end, the walls remember. Stone, unlike people, does not lie. Now, as we reach the final part of this journey through the most bizarre and hidden sexual practices of the medieval world, prepare to encounter the most enduring myth of all, one that still appears in museums, jokes, and even historical debates, one that was locked with a key, rusted over time, and left behind not just physical scars, but a legacy of mistrust. In the shadowy corners of medieval Europe, far from the bells of the church and the reach of royal courts, there existed beliefs so unsettling that even whispers about them were enough to cause panic. Among the most secretive and disturbing of these was the use of dead bodies in fertility rituals. This was not widespread, but records from inquisitions and folklore accounts suggest that certain fringe cults and underground sects treated corpses not as reminders of mortality, but as tools of supposed spiritual power. These were not ordinary funerals or misunderstood traditions. They were calculated and deeply taboo practices aimed at harnessing something believed to lie between life and death. In some cases, the body of a recently deceased person, often a young woman or man who had not yet been buried, was placed on a ceremonial slab or altar. Around this cold and motionless figure, followers of the ritual would gather and conduct what they believed to be a rite of rebirth. It wasn't uncommon for a couple to engage in intercourse near or beside the corpse, believing that doing so would absorb lingering vitality from the deceased. They thought that the soul heat still clinging to the dead body could be transferred to their own bodies, bringing luck in conception or protection against infertility. It's the kind of ritual that makes you wonder how anyone thought this would lead to new life instead of nightmares. Some groups tied this practice to ancient fertility gods, or local nature spirits, whose favour they hoped to gain by blurring the lines between death and creation. The corpse, in their view, was a vessel emptied too soon, and its proximity to a living union was thought to help cycle energy back into the world. The logic was circular and deeply flawed, but to the people involved, it made spiritual sense. Fertility was not just about life, it was about mystery, risk, and sometimes invoking forces they barely understood. Inquisition records from parts of France, northern Italy, and certain Germanic regions mention instances of what they called negrophilic fertility rites. These were not described with clinical detail, but often with fear and condemnation. Most reports came from confessions extracted under pressure or by chance discovery when someone betrayed a neighbour. Often, the church used these cases as justification to burn heretics or close down entire villages. But historians now believe that these rituals were extremely rare and probably not organised beyond small family circles or travelling mystic groups. What made these ceremonies even more alarming was the blend of superstition and intimacy. Participants were not always coerced. Some believed it was an act of love or spiritual courage. For others, especially those struggling with infertility or cursed reputations, this was a desperate attempt to fix something they thought was broken inside them. And in a time when medical knowledge was thin and childbirth a deadly gamble, it's not surprising that even horrifying ideas could take root if they offered hope. If this happened today, it would end up on a conspiracy blog somewhere between alien DNA and ghost babies. The physical setting of these rituals was often caves, abandoned churches, or secluded forest clearings, places where no one would hear or question. Sometimes the body was an unclaimed corpse, other times it was taken secretly from a grave before burial. These acts were carried out with rituals of silence and symbolic gestures, including burning herbs or chanting words believed to protect the living from the wrath of the dead. The contradiction was clear. They feared the spirit of the corpse but still sought to use it. Faith and fear danced in uncomfortable balance. Eventually, church officials became more aggressive in hunting down these practices. In some areas, they issued specific bans on disturbing the dead and placed guards near cemeteries during festivals linked to fertility or the solstice. Some communities were forced to exhume bodies to prove that no foul rites had occurred. In sermons and public trials, clergy referred to participants as worshippers of demons or those who drink from the grave. The terminology was meant to shock and isolate, painting the accused as dangerous threats to both faith and order. I can't help but feel that this practice speaks more to medieval despair than medieval evil. Over time, these rituals faded, not because people stopped believing, but because fear of punishment outweighed faith in the results. Folk memory still held fragments of the practice, though, with some regions telling stories of children born from cursed unions or of fields that grew blood-coloured wheat. Whether those tales were metaphors or distorted memories, they show that the idea of blending death and fertility left a long mark on collective imagination. In museums today, you might see carvings or drawings that once depicted fertility rites, though the corpses are rarely shown. More often, the focus is on symbols, snakes, bones, and flowers that hint at cycles of decay and renewal. Only careful research and sometimes uncomfortable questions lead us to what lies beneath those symbols, that under all the poetic imagery, real people were doing real things in the dark, out of fear, out of hope, or both. It's easy to laugh at or judge these acts from the safety of distance, but we must remember that medieval life was full of quiet desperation. When medicine fails, when prayers go unanswered, people will do almost anything to feel some control, even if it means reaching into the grave. The horror is real, but so is humanity. As we end this journey through the strangest corners of medieval sexuality, one thing becomes clear. Human desire has always found a way, even when covered in shame, chains, or myth. The practices may be long gone, but the questions they raise about power, belief, and the body remain. So tonight, as the world quiets and your pillow grows warm, let the past stay in the past. You've seen enough for one evening. Sleep well, far from the flickering torches and whispered prayers of midnight rituals.